How does a broken mirror expose buried crimes and force a detective to face her past? Follow the clues and suspects in the story to find the answer. Detective Elise Grayson arrived at the abandoned train station as the sun dipped behind a skeletal tree line, painting the scene in bruised shades of violet and gray. The station had long been out of use, a relic from an era of iron and steam, now suffocated by creeping vines and rust. Elise didn't need the crumpled call sheet to tell her why she was here. She could feel it, a tension coiled tightly in the air, taut as a wire ready to snap. The platform was empty, save for the remnants of humanity, scattered beer bottles, cigarette butts, and a broken umbrella dangling pathetically from the railing. A uniformed officer stood stiffly near the entrance to the waiting room, his face pale against the encroaching dusk. He gestured her over without a word. Inside, the air was damp and foul, the scent of rot clinging to the walls. A single bare bulb cast a weak light over the room's only piece of furniture, a long-forgotten bench, warped with age. On it sat a small object, unnervingly pristine amid the decay, a shard of blood-streaked glass. Elise crouched, careful not to disturb the scene. Her fingers hovered near the glass but didn't touch it. The smear of blood was fresh. "Found it just like this," the officer murmured, his voice trembling. "No sign of a struggle. No body. Just that." Elise straightened, her mind racing. The glass was jagged, a fragment from something larger. A mirror, perhaps, or a window. Her gaze flicked to the walls, the boarded-up windows, the creaking wooden ceiling. What had shattered here? And where was the rest of it? Her phone buzzed sharply in her pocket, jarring her from the thought. She pulled it out and saw an incoming call from an unfamiliar number. Ignoring the officer's curious glance, she answered. "Elise Grayson." A pause. "Elise," a voice rasped. It was low, guttural, and dripping with menace. "The glass isn't just a clue, it's a warning. You're already too late." The line went dead. Elise stood frozen, the dead line in her hand. A chill crawled up her spine, as though the unseen eyes of the station were fixed on her. She stared at the officer, but he looked just as bewildered. "Detective, are you all right?" His voice cracked. Elise didn't answer immediately. Instead, she replayed the words in her mind, "You're already too late." Her grip tightened on the phone. "I need backup securing the area," she said finally, her tone sharp. "Block off the exits. No one comes or goes." The officer nodded and hurried outside, leaving her alone with the shard of glass and the dim, stifling air. She pulled a pair of gloves from her pocket and carefully picked up the shard. The blood, vibrant under the weak light, had begun to dry. A streak of crimson hinted at a violent edge, a swipe or a struggle. Her thoughts were interrupted by a second officer entering, this one older, with a calm but wary demeanor. Detective Henry LaMontagne was her reluctant partner on this case, a man known for his brusque manner and near-superstitious fear of unsolved mysteries. "This the scene?" LaMontagne asked, sweeping his eyes over the room. "It's the start of one," Elise muttered, holding the glass aloft. "No body. No signs of a break-in. Just this. And someone called me." LaMontagne's brow furrowed. "Who?" "Unknown number. They said I'm too late." "Too late for what?" Elise didn't answer. Instead, she knelt by the bench again, studying the floor. Dust covered most of the room, but a small patch near the bench had been disturbed. The smudged imprint of a shoe sole was barely visible. Male, probably. Size 11 or 12. She pulled out her phone and snapped a photo before motioning to LaMontagne. "Help me flip this bench." Together, they tipped the heavy wood aside. Beneath it, the floorboards were uneven, one of them slightly ajar. Elise pried it loose with her gloved hands, revealing a hollow space beneath. Inside was a crumpled paper, smeared with blood. LaMontagne grimaced as Elise unfolded it. The writing was barely legible, shaky and uneven, but the message was unmistakable. "He's watching. He always has." Elise's chest tightened. She glanced at LaMontagne, who stared at the note like it might combust in his hands. This just became more than a missing person, he said grimly. Before Elise could respond, her phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a call, it was a text. She opened it and felt the breath leave her lungs. A photo filled the screen, a group of people seated around a dinner table. They were laughing mid-toast, as though frozen in time. But her eyes zeroed in on the man at the head of the table, his face partially obscured by shadow. And on the polished surface of the table in front of him, reflecting the light like a malicious grin, was a blood-smeared shard of glass. Elise stared at the photo, her pulse pounding in her ears. The shadowed figure at the head of the table was eerily still, his face just beyond clarity. Yet something about the posture, the tilt of his head, made her skin crawl. She turned the phone to La Montagna. "Recognize anyone?" He squinted at the image. "The resolution's crap. Looks like it was taken through a window or something." He paused, then tapped the screen. "Wait. That guy on the left, he's familiar. Could be James Fenton. Real estate mogul." Elise nodded slowly. Fenton's name had been on her desk just last week. He was part of an ongoing investigation into an embezzlement scheme tied to several unsavory figures in the city. He wasn't the type to scare easily, but the cryptic note and photos suggested something far more personal. "We need to find out where this picture was taken," Elise said, scrolling for any metadata. But there was nothing, just the photo, raw and untraceable. La Montagna gestured to the note. "This watching business. It's got a stalker vibe, doesn't it? Or worse," Elise said, her tone colder than she intended. She slipped the shard and the note into evidence bags. "Whoever left this here wanted us to find it. And wanted you to get that call," La Montagna added. "This is deliberate. Personal." Before Elise could reply, her phone buzzed again. Another text. This one was a single word, "Look." A moment later, a second message arrived, an address. Elise showed the screen to La Montagna, who frowned deeply. "That's downtown. Not far from Fenton's office." "Let's move," Elise said, already heading for the door. The address led them to an upscale apartment building with a glass facade that gleamed even in the dim evening light. Elise felt a pang of unease as they entered the lobby. It was too quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears. The elevator ride to the 11th floor was agonizingly slow, the soft hum of the machinery only amplifying her tension. When the doors opened, they were met with a long, dimly lit hallway. At the end of it, one door stood ajar. Elise drew her weapon, signaling for La Montagna to follow. They approached cautiously, the floor creaking faintly under their weight. She nudged the door open with the barrel of her gun and stepped inside. The apartment was immaculate, every surface gleaming under recessed lighting. A single table was set up in the center of the room, draped with a pristine white cloth. On it sat a centerpiece, a circular mirror cracked into jagged fragments, its surface spattered with blood. Around the table were 4 chairs. On each was a name tag: James Fenton, Margaret Yates, Dr. Elias Green, and her own, Elise Grayson. La Montagna swore under his breath as Elise approached the table. She touched her name tag gingerly, her gloves slick against the polished paper. "This is a message," she said softly. "And a challenge." La Montagna pointed to the mirror. "What's the bet these names are our suspects?" Elise's gut told her he was right. But as she stared at her own name, seated among them, a darker possibility wormed its way into her thoughts. What if the game wasn't just about solving the case? What if she was part of it? Elise's mind raced as she stared at the cracked mirror and the names surrounding it. Each one was etched in bold, almost ceremonial strokes, as if chosen carefully. She snapped a picture for the record before stepping back. La Montagna crouched, inspecting the bloody fragments. "I don't like this, Elise. This isn't just a warning. This is staging. Someone wants our attention, and they're putting you in the crosshairs." Elise's phone buzzed. Another text. "Pick a seat." Her jaw clenched. Whoever was orchestrating this wasn't just taunting her, they were controlling the pace, daring her to play their game. "We need to pull their backgrounds," she said, motioning to the names. Full profiles. Every connection, no matter how small. La Montagna nodded. Fenton's already on our radar. What about the others? Margaret Yates, Elise read aloud, her voice steady despite the mounting unease. High-profile defense attorney. Known for taking on controversial cases. She's made enemies, no doubt, La Montagna muttered. Dr. Elias Green, Elise continued. Renowned psychiatrist. Specializes in criminal psychology. He's been a consultant on some major cases. Brilliant mind. Makes him dangerous if he's involved, La Montagna said grimly. He gestured to the final name. And then there's you. I'm not a suspect, Elise shot back. But even as she said it, the implications of her inclusion gnawed at her. Why would the orchestrator want her here? Was it personal? Or worse, was she the key to whatever this was? They reconvened at the station, where a research team was already pulling files on the names. Elise and La Montagna pored over the information as it trickled in. James Fenton, wealthy real estate mogul with ties to several questionable investments. Rumored to have bribed city officials to secure land deals, but no solid charges ever stuck. Margaret Yates, celebrated for her courtroom prowess and infamous for defending clients accused of heinous crimes. Recently, she had defended a serial killer who walked free on a technicality, sparking public outrage. Dr. Elias Green, praised for his expertise in criminal behavior, but whispers of impropriety lingered. Several former patients had filed complaints, alleging unethical treatment, though none resulted in formal charges. Elise rubbed her temples, exhaustion creeping in. 3 powerful people with messy pasts. But no immediate connection between them, or to me. Maybe the connection isn't about the past, La Montagna suggested. What if it's about what's coming? Elise frowned, considering the possibility. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. One of the analysts stepped in, holding a folder. Detective Grayson, you might want to see this. Elise took the file, her pulse quickening as she opened it. Inside was a grainy surveillance image, time-stamped 2 hours ago. It showed a shadowy figure leaving the abandoned train station. The figure was tall, wearing a long coat and gloves. In their hand was a bag, barely visible but unmistakably holding something bulky. Her gut twisted. Do we have an ID? The analyst shook his head. Not yet. But there's more. He handed her another photo, this one a zoomed-in shot of the bag. The edges of something metallic and bloody peeked through a tear in the fabric. Elise exhaled sharply. The rest of the mirror. La Montagna cursed under his breath. So this isn't over. No, Elise said, her voice hard. It's just beginning. The station buzzed with a rare energy. It was New Year's Eve, and despite the grim case weighing on everyone's minds, the sounds of clinking coffee mugs and subdued laughter filtered through the precinct. Officers exchanged plans for the evening, many eagerly awaiting midnight. For Elise, the countdown felt like a shadow pressing closer, each second a step towards something sinister. The case had taken root in her mind like a splinter, each detail sharper, each clue more jagged. The mirror, the blood, the names. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Detective, La Montagna said, interrupting her thoughts. He stood in the doorway, his coat already on. You should see this. She followed him outside, where a winter wind bit at her cheeks. Snow flurries danced under the streetlights, masking the city in an eerie quiet. La Montagna led her to a patrol car, where an officer handed her a sealed evidence bag. Inside was another shard of mirror, this one pristine, free of blood. It had been delivered anonymously to the station moments ago, taped to a black and gold card that read, "Join me for the stroke of midnight." Below it was another address. Elise felt her stomach twist. Another invitation, La Montagna said grimly. The address led them to the city's heart, where New Year's festivities were in full swing. Crowds spilled into the streets, their laughter and cheers rising with each countdown shouted by enthusiastic revelers. Bright lights from a nearby ballroom illuminated the snow-dusted pavement. The building itself was stately, its Art Deco facade a relic of a bygone era. The glass doors shimmered with gold detailing, and a sign above read, "The Bellevue Grand, New Year's Gala." "You think this is it?" La Montagne asked, his tone skeptical. "It fits the pattern," Elise replied. "But whoever's behind this doesn't want to be found." "Not yet." They entered the lobby, where a cheerful concierge greeted them. Inside, guests in tuxedos and glittering gowns mingled, their laughter punctuated by the clinking of champagne flutes. A large clock dominated the far wall, its hands inching toward midnight. Elise scanned the room, searching for anything out of place. Amid the opulence, her eyes fell on a table tucked into the corner, unoccupied except for a silver envelope resting in the center. She approached cautiously, La Montagne trailing behind her. The envelope bore her name in flowing script. Inside was a card with another message: "Time reveals all. Find the missing pieces before midnight." Elise cursed under her breath. "This is a game to them. What's the play here?" La Montagne asked, scanning the room for threats. Before she could answer, the lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the crowd. A spotlight illuminated the stage, where a performer began singing a slow, haunting rendition of Auld Lang Syne. The mournful melody sent a shiver down Elise's spine. Her phone buzzed. Another text. "You're running out of time." The message lit a fire under her. Elise knew whoever had orchestrated this wasn't far. She scanned the crowd again, this time focusing on faces, movements. Then she spotted it, a figure near the clock, dressed in black, their face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. They seemed out of place among the glittering partygoers, their posture rigid, their presence almost calculated. "Over there," Elise said, nudging La Montagne. As they approached, the figure turned, slipping through a side door with unnerving grace. Elise and La Montagne gave chase, weaving through the narrow, dimly lit corridors of the grand old building. The sound of their footsteps echoed eerily, drowned out only by the distant cheer of the crowd counting down. 10, 9, 8. The figure disappeared into a small room at the end of the hall. Elise entered cautiously, her weapon drawn. The room was bare except for a table, and on it, the final piece of the shattered mirror. A clock ticked loudly on the wall, its hands frozen at midnight. Behind her, the door slammed shut. "Elise!" La Montagne's voice was muffled on the other side, the doorknob rattling uselessly. She turned back to the table, where a note rested beside the mirror. "Happy New Year, Detective. The real game begins now." Elise's breath puffed in shallow bursts as she surveyed the locked room. The walls were bare, the air tinged with the acrid scent of dust and age. She approached the table cautiously, her eyes darting between the mirror shard and the note. The clock's frozen hands seemed to mock her, their stillness a cruel taunt. Outside, the muffled sound of the crowd cheered in unison. 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year! Elise ignored the distant celebration and focused on the shard. Its surface gleamed under the dim overhead light, reflecting fractured, distorted images of the room. Something about its pattern tugged at her memory, something familiar. She slipped on her gloves and picked up the shard. The jagged edges fit perfectly against the one from the train station, creating a larger piece of the puzzle. A faint mark became visible as she turned the assembled fragment under the light. It was an engraving, barely perceptible, 1245. "Elise!" La Montagne's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. "I'm getting this door open!" A loud crack followed, and the door splintered as he forced it open. He rushed inside, his gun drawn. "What the hell's going on?" Elise held up the shard. "The pieces fit together. Look!" She showed him the faint engraving. 1245? He asked, frowning. "A time? Or an address?" "Could be both," Elise muttered, her mind racing. She pocketed the shard and note before stepping out of the room. The sounds of the gala had faded, leaving the hall eerily quiet. Together, they retraced their steps to the lobby. The opulent space was nearly deserted now, save for a few lingering guests and the soft strains of a piano from the ballroom. Elise scanned the area, her eyes falling on a massive clock above the entrance. Its hands pointed to midnight, but as she stared, The hour hand seemed to shift imperceptibly, stopping at 12:45. There, she whispered, pointing to the clock. Below it, a small door led to what appeared to be a stairwell. La Montagne followed as Elise pushed through the door. The narrow stairs spiraled downward, the temperature dropping with every step. The faint sound of dripping water echoed, each drop a metronome counting the moments. At the bottom, they emerged into a cold, cavernous space, a long-abandoned wine cellar. Rows of empty racks loomed like skeletal sentinels, their shadows dancing in the faint light of Elise's flashlight. At the center of the room stood a figure, their back turned. "Elise Grayson," the figure said, their voice calm, almost amused. "You made it." Elise raised her weapon. "Turn around." Slowly. The figure obeyed, revealing a pale face framed by a mane of dark hair. A man in his 50s, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, with a smirk that oozed confidence. His eyes gleamed with a dangerous intelligence. "You've been busy," the man said, his tone dripping with mock admiration. "But you've barely scratched the surface." "Who are you?" Elise demanded. "Why target me?" The man stepped closer, his movements deliberate. "All in good time, detective. For now, let's call this a test. You and I, we're not so different. We both see the cracks, the fractures in the world. But while you try to fix them," he gestured to the shards in her pocket, "I show them for what they truly are." La Montagne's voice was steady. "Get on the ground. Hands behind your head." The man ignored him, his gaze fixed on Elise. "Did you enjoy the chase? The clues? The thrill of the unknown? Because this was just the beginning. The mirror, when whole, will reveal everything. If you survive long enough to piece it together." Before Elise could respond, a deafening explosion rocked the room, blinding them with a flash of light. When the dust settled, the man was gone, leaving only a final shard of the mirror behind. Elise picked it up, her hands trembling. A single word was etched into its surface: trust. The shard's message, trust, etched into its gleaming surface, burned in Elise's mind as they climbed out of the cellar. Above, the gala's remnants had dissolved into quiet. The crowd was gone, leaving only discarded confetti and the faint echoes of celebration. "Elise, he's playing you," La Montagne said, his voice strained. "This trust nonsense, it's manipulation. Whoever this guy is, he's setting you up." She didn't answer immediately, her mind too tangled in the threads of the puzzle. The mirror, the names, the precise staging, it wasn't just a trap. It was a web, and she was at its center. "Maybe," she murmured. "But he wants me to find something. This isn't just about me, it's about the pieces of that mirror." "Then what's next?" La Montagne asked. She pulled the shards from her pocket and fitted them together again. With each piece, the engraving grew clearer, forming what now appeared to be coordinates. Elise's phone buzzed as she pieced it together, a message from the same unknown number. It read, "Do you see the reflection now? Follow it." Below was a map pin, the coordinates matched the engraving. The location was a desolate warehouse near the docks, shrouded in mist and the faint tang of salt water. The moonlight illuminated its rusted exterior, casting long shadows across the icy ground. Elise and La Montagne stepped cautiously through the main entrance, their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. Inside, the air was frigid and heavy with the scent of mildew. A single bulb swung from the ceiling, flickering weakly and casting fragmented light across the room. At the center was a table, eerily similar to the one from the gala. On it lay another mirror shard, surrounded by 4 manila folders. Elise approached, her breath visible in the cold air. The folders bore the names of the 4 people at the stage dinner: James Fenton, Margaret Yates, Dr. Elias Green, and herself. She opened Fenton's folder first. Inside were photos and documents, financial records, incriminating evidence of his real estate scams, and a candid shot of him meeting with a known crime lord. The man's crimes were laid bare, each page a damning accusation. Margaret Yates's folder was next, filled with threatening letters from the families of victims she'd defended, including one chilling note that read, your time will come. Dr. Elias Green's folder detailed allegations of coercion, mental abuse, and unethical experimentation. A hidden report described a patient's death under suspicious circumstances. Then came her folder. Elise hesitated before opening it. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. When she finally did, her hands trembled. Inside were pages of her own career, a detailed account of every case she'd ever worked. Notes were scribbled in the margins, pointing out moments of hesitation, errors in judgment. The final page held a simple message: "Can you trust yourself?" Lamontagne read over her shoulder, his expression grim. "This guy's been watching all of us. Collecting dirt." "It's more than that," Elise said, her voice low. "He's passing judgment." She reached for the final shard on the table. As she picked it up, the warehouse filled with a sudden, piercing sound, a recording of her own voice, from a case years ago. "Sometimes the truth is worse than the lie," her voice said. "But we don't get to choose what we see." The light swung violently, throwing chaotic shadows as the recording repeated itself. Elise gritted her teeth, the shards in her hand feeling heavier with each passing second. "Turn it off!" Lamontagne shouted, his voice barely audible over the din. Elise's gaze snapped to a figure in the shadows, watching from the rafters above. The figure stepped forward slightly, their face still obscured. "Are you ready to see the full picture, detective?" the voice called out, echoing ominously. "You've almost earned it." Before she could respond, the lights cut out completely, plunging them into darkness. Darkness consumed the warehouse, swallowing the faint moonlight that seeped through cracks in the walls. Elise's breathing steadied as her training kicked in. She raised her flashlight, its narrow beam cutting through the pitch black, casting fleeting glimpses of rusted beams and dusty concrete. "Lamontagne?" she called, her voice low. "Here," came his reply close by. His flashlight flickered on, revealing his tense face. "He's still in here. I saw him." The recording of her voice had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the groan of the building settling. Elise scanned the rafters but saw no movement. She moved toward the table, careful to pocket the last shard of the mirror. "We need to get out of this trap," Lamontagne said. "We're blind in here." Elise shook her head. "Not yet. He's still watching us. This place is part of the game." Lamontagne muttered something under his breath, but she wasn't listening. Her focus shifted to the table, where the folders lay open. Something about their arrangement tugged at her attention. They weren't placed haphazardly, they formed a shape, a triangle of sorts, with her folder at the apex. "Elise!" Lamontagne's warning tone drew her back. He was aiming his flashlight toward the far wall. The beam landed on a painted symbol, a fractured circle with jagged lines radiating outward, like shards of glass. Beneath the symbol were words scrawled in dripping black paint: "The mirror shows all." Before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed overhead. They both snapped their flashlights toward the rafters, catching fleeting glimpses of the figure as it darted through the shadows. "Freeze!" Lamontagne shouted, drawing his weapon. The figure stopped suddenly, standing at the edge of a beam high above. They were silhouetted against the faint glow of a broken window, their features still obscured. A voice rang out, distorted by the cavernous space. "You've come this far, detective. Are you ready to see the truth? Or will you turn away, like you did before?" Elise's chest tightened. "What truth? What are you trying to prove?" The figure laughed softly, the sound more unnerving than any threat. "You already know. You've seen the cracks. The question is, what will you do when they shatter?" The figure turned and stepped off the beam. "No!" Elise shouted, sprinting forward. Her flashlight beam hit empty space as the figure disappeared into the darkness below. Seconds later, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse, followed by silence. She reached the edge of the rafter's shadow, her flashlight sweeping the floor below. Lamontagne joined her, his face pale. Together, they descended to where the figure had fallen. The crash led them to a pile of crates, their splintered remains scattered across the floor. But there was no body, no trace of blood, just another mirror shard lying among the debris, its surface reflecting the fractured circle symbol from the wall. Elise picked it up, her grip tightening as her reflection stared back, warped and distorted. Words were etched faintly into the shard's edge. Final piece waits where the year ends. La Montagne leaned over her shoulder, his breath visible in the cold air. What the hell does that mean? Elise pocketed the shard, her jaw set. New Year's. Midnight. This isn't over. The drive back to the station was silent, tension thick between Elise and La Montagne. The city streets were eerily quiet in the wake of the New Year's celebration, confetti sticking wetly to the sidewalks. Elise's mind churned, replaying the figure's words. Final piece waits where the year ends. Where the year ends? La Montagne finally said, breaking the silence. Could mean midnight, but we've already passed that. Elise shook her head. It's more specific. A location. Somewhere symbolic. La Montagne frowned, glancing out the window. A calendar factory? A cemetery? Hell, it could be anything. The pieces rattled faintly in her pocket as Elise pulled them out. In the dim light of the car, she examined them again. Each shard carried a weight, not just in the bloodied memories but in the careful markings etched into their surfaces. Together, they pointed towards something whole. Let's focus, she said. Fenton, Yates, Green. They all had connections to power, secrets they wanted buried. What's the link? La Montagne rubbed his temples. Fenton and Yates worked deals together. That's clear from the files. Green. Maybe he treated them? Or blackmailed them? Elise tapped the steering wheel as an idea struck her. What if they all worked together to cover something up? Something that ties back to this. The mirror, La Montagne said, his voice low. The reflection shows all. Their secrets. Their guilt. And if that's true, Elise added grimly, the final piece reveals it. At the station, Elise combed through maps, databases, and every report tied to the suspects. The answer came just before dawn, in the form of an old news article buried deep in the archives. Got it, she said, holding up the printout. The Overlook Club. La Montagne raised an eyebrow. That abandoned lodge near the river? Not just abandoned. It was a private retreat for the city's elite. Fenton, Yates, and Green were members. A scandal shut it down years ago. Money laundering, corruption, rumors of violence. But the final investigation? Quietly dropped. No charges. And you think that's where this ends? La Montagne asked. It fits, Elise said. Where the year ends, a place stuck in time, frozen in its own corruption. Midnight might have passed, but the symbolism? Perfect. The Overlook Club was a sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city, its grandeur long since faded. Snow blanketed the ground, muffling their footsteps as they approached. The main doors, once ornate, hung slightly ajar. Inside, the lodge reeked of decay and abandonment. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and the remnants of opulence, chandeliers, grand staircases, loomed like specters in the faint morning light. The air was heavy, oppressive. At the center of the grand hall was a circular table, much like the ones before. On it lay the final shard of the mirror, larger than the others and pristine, its edges glowing faintly in the gloom. Elise approached cautiously, her heart hammering. The moment she touched the shard, lights flickered on, bathing the room in cold, artificial brightness. "You've done well, detective," a familiar voice echoed. She turned sharply to see the same figure from the warehouse stepping into view. This time, their face was fully visible, Dr. Elias Green. His expression was calm, almost reverent. "You," Elise said, her voice low and dangerous. "This is all you?" Green tilted his head, his eyes gleaming with something unhinged. "Not all. I merely brought the pieces together. It's the mirror that holds the truth." He gestured to the shards in her hand. "Finish it, detective. Complete the reflection. See for yourself." Elise stared at Dr. Elias Green, the shards heavy in her hand. The air in the Overlook Club seemed to thrum, as though the building itself was holding its breath. La Montagne's gun was trained on Green, but the man didn't flinch. He simply gestured to the table, where the final shard gleamed like a sinister beacon. "What happens when the mirror is whole?" Elise demanded. "The truth," Green said softly, his voice carrying an almost reverent tone. "For years, people like Fenton, Yates, and I thrived in shadows, protected by our power and your indifference. But mirrors don't lie, Detective. They reveal. They punish. You want answers? Put the pieces together." Elise hesitated. This was a trap, she could feel it. But every instinct told her that not finishing the mirror would leave the case unresolved, the victim silenced, and the true story buried. "Elise," La Montagne warned. "We don't have to play his game." "Maybe we do," she said, her voice tight. Slowly, she placed the shards on the table, one by one, fitting them together with trembling precision. The final shard clicked into place. For a moment, nothing happened. The mirror lay before them, its jagged edges glinting under the dim light. Then, the surface began to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. Images swirled across its face, vivid and horrifying. The first reflection was of a dimly lit room, much like the one they stood in now. 3 figures, Fenton, Yates, and Green, stood over a bound and gagged man. Their faces were twisted in cruelty, their hands stained with blood. The victim's eyes were wide with terror as Fenton raised the hammer, bringing it down in a sickening arc. Elise's stomach churned as the scene shifted. Now the 3 conspirators were seated at a lavish table, glasses raised in a toast. Documents passed between them, bribes, blackmail, cover-ups. Each act solidified their power, but their paranoia grew with every deal. The images began to fragment, faster and faster, flashing like a strobe. Victims, silenced and discarded. Crimes swept under the rug. Fenton's greed. Yates's manipulation. Green's experiments. And then Elise saw herself. The image froze on a scene from years ago, Elise, younger, standing over a desk piled with case files. Her expression was weary, her movements mechanical. On the desk was a file marked Overlooked Case. She opened it, scanned the pages, and closed it, shaking her head. The file was placed in a drawer, never to be reopened. "What is this?" she whispered, stepping back. "The case you ignored," Green said, his voice cutting. "The one that could have stopped us years ago. But you didn't dig deep enough. You let it go." Elise's hands clenched into fists. "You're saying this is my fault? That's why you dragged me into this?" Green smiled coldly. "Not just yours. We're all guilty, Detective. The mirror doesn't choose sides. It only shows the cracks." The mirror's surface began to crackle, fractures spreading like spiderwebs. A low hum filled the room, growing louder, more oppressive. Green stepped closer, his voice rising above the noise. "You've seen it now, haven't you? The truth. The reflection. What will you do with it?" Before Elise could respond, the mirror shattered, shards exploding outward in a blinding burst of light. She threw her arms up, shielding herself as the sound reverberated like a gunshot. When the light faded, Green was gone. Only the shards of the mirror remained, scattered across the floor. La Montagne helped Elise to her feet, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" Elise stared at the shattered remains, her reflection fragmented across the pieces. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "A reminder." "A reminder of what?" "That we don't just solve crimes. We stop them from happening. If we fail, this is what's left." Elise stared at the shards of the shattered mirror, their sharp edges reflecting fragments of her face. Her expression was taut, her mind reeling with the weight of what she'd seen. The room was heavy with silence, the echo of the mirror's destruction still ringing in her ears. La Montagne placed a hand on her shoulder. "Elise, what now? Green's gone, and we've got nothing to tie him to this mess." She bent down, carefully gathering the shards into a bag. "We have the mirror's story. That's a start. And what? We tell the department that a psychotic doctor set up some deranged scavenger hunt to expose his crimes and ours. You know how that'll sound." She met his gaze, her eyes hardened. We don't need to tell them everything. But we have enough to bring Fenton and Yates down. Green's their connection. He'll resurface when we start pulling at the threads. La Montagne hesitated, then nodded. And what about you? That file, the overlooked case. Elise's jaw tightened. The reflection of her past failures stung more than she wanted to admit. I'll reopen it. Every lead, every victim we missed, I'll make it right. The days that followed were a blur of arrests, media frenzy, and buried secrets dragged into the light. Fenton's empire crumbled as evidence of his corruption came to light. Yates faced public outrage for her role in defending dangerous criminals, many of whom had ties to Green's network. Green himself remained a ghost, his whereabouts unknown. But Elise knew he was still watching. On New Year's Day, Elise sat in her office, staring at the shards of the mirror spread across her desk. Each piece felt like a confession, a whispered accusation from the past. She traced her finger along the jagged edge of one shard, its reflective surface distorting her face. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Truth is a beginning, not an end. Until next time. Elise exhaled sharply, the tension in her chest coiling tighter. She deleted the message and slid the mirror shards into a box, locking them away on her desk. La Montagne appeared in the doorway, his expression weary but determined. Ready to tackle the overlooked files? She nodded, standing and grabbing her coat. Let's start where the cracks began. Together they left the office, stepping into a world that had already begun to heal, unaware of the shadows still lurking in the fractures. The end.
Thanks for listening. Subscribe, like, and don't miss the next scary stories. Bye-bye.